Usually when we talk about being a fan of something, I mean like a movie, a band, a book, whatever, it usually means you accept it, warts and all. You just love the whole package.
Right. Yeah. You take the good with the bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what happens when a self-proclaimed huge fan of one of the most famous self-help books of all time decides that, well, the book is absolutely brilliant, but it fundamentally needs a major philosophical scrub?
It creates this really fascinating tension. I mean, it's basically the literary equivalent of loving a historic house, but deciding you need to completely rip out and replace the foundation because you just don't trust the concrete.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You want to save the house, obviously, but you have to systematically lift it off its original base to actually do so.
Okay, well, let's unpack this. Because to understand the 2% that the author of our main source today wants to scrub out, we first really need to respect the 98% that he wants to keep.
Right, the stuff that works.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we are looking at a really detailed essay by Sean Powrey. It's a secular critique of Stephen Covey's massive bestseller, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Which is just a juggernaut of a book.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a book that has sold over 25 million copies. It has shaped modern business, personal development, family therapy. I mean, you name it.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
And most of you listening are probably already familiar with the core paradigms. We aren't going to sit here and define what a habit is.
Right. You likely already know about concepts like the emotional bank account.
Yes, that brilliant metaphor for the trust built up in a relationship where, courtesy and honesty are deposits and broken commitments are withdrawals.
Exactly. Or the PPC balance, balancing the production of your desired results, those are the golden eggs, with the health of the actual asset producing them, which is the goose.
The goose, right.
And Powrey, the author of our main critique, he reads this book multiple times. He actively strives to adopt these habits. He really believes they are incredibly useful mental models.
So the structure of the house, to use your analogy, is incredibly sound.
Yeah, exactly.
But the friction comes entirely from the concrete. Because Stephen Covey was a prominent Mormon, and our sources note that 7 years before he wrote The 7 Habits, he actually wrote an earlier book aimed specifically at a Mormon audience.
Right, it was called The Divine Center.
Yeah, The Divine Center.
Yeah.
And Powrey argues that The 7 Habits is essentially a secularized version of those exact same teachings. The problem is, the dial in theism just wasn't turned all the way down to zero.
Well, and you have to remember, when the book was published in the late 1980s, secular often just meant, acceptable for a broad, general Christian audience to read without raising eyebrows.
Right, not actually devoid of religion.
Exactly. It didn't mean entirely devoid of religious concepts. So the underlying worldview in the book is still deeply rooted in a divine creator.
But, if the book is 98% perfect and the principles actually work in the real world, like if you can use that PPC balance to stop burning out at your startup, why bother critiquing the remaining 2%?
Yeah, it's a fair question.
Is this just, semantic nitpicking? Who cares if the author thinks God made the rules, as long as the rules help me organize my inbox and be a better manager?
It is a totally fair challenge, but for a truly secular reader, it is far more than just semantics.
How so?
Well, the vocabulary and the underlying philosophy actually act as a psychological barrier. When you're trying to adopt a whole new operating system for your life, bumping into what Powrey calls theological thought stoppers.
Theological thought stoppers. I like that phrase.
Right. It creates cognitive dissonance. It basically alienates the reader from what is otherwise life-changing advice.
Okay, so let's look at where that collision actually happens first. Because there's a very specific line in Covey's foreword to the 2004 edition of the book.
Oh, right. The part about cynicism.
Yeah. Covey writes that modern culture tends to succumb to, quote, growing secularism and cynicism. And he links those two words together as if they're basically synonymous.
Yeah.
As if walking away from religion automatically means you're walking into this state of bitter, jaded cynicism.
And that's exactly where Powrey objects. But you have to look at it from Covey's deeply religious worldview. From that perspective, secularism actually feels cynical.
Really? A lot.
Because when someone unabashedly rejects the religious ideas, the ancient texts, and the divine authorities that believers build their entire reality around, it registers to the believer as a cynical dismissal of the sacred.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Powrey points out a profound misunderstanding here. Covey is essentially conflating secularism with meaninglessness, or, nihilism.
Which is a huge leap. You can absolutely lack a belief in a deity without thinking the universe is some bleak, meaningless void.
Exactly. And to illustrate why this happens, Parry uses this really brilliant analogy in the source text involving Thor, the Norse god of thunder.
Okay, I love this part.
Yeah, so imagine a devout, ancient believer in Thor having a conversation with a traditional, modern Christian.
Right.
The Christian politely says, look, Thor's just a myth. He's a fascinating story, but he isn't real.
And the Thor believer gets deeply offended.
Right. The Thor believer asks, why are you being so cynical about my deeply held beliefs?
But the Christian doesn't feel cynical at all. They just think they're observing reality.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly maps onto the dynamic between the secular reader and the religious author.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah, the secular reader isn't being cynical by rejecting a divine mandate. They're simply interacting with what they perceive as the factual reality of the universe.
Right, because a secular life can be incredibly rich. It can be driven by deep curiosity, the pursuit of scientific truth, the creation of art.
And the very real, very urgent human desire to alleviate suffering in the here and now.
Exactly. None of that is cynical.
Not at all.
Okay, but if we establish that a secular person isn't cynical, and they can still find profound meaning in life principles like the 7 habits, well, it forces a massive question.
Right.
Where do those principles actually come from? I mean, if they don't come from a divine source, who wrote the rules? Because Covey explicitly states in the book that correct principles are natural laws and that their ultimate source is God.
Right. For Covey, these principles are divine decrees. They are woven into the fabric of the universe by a creator, much like gravity.
Okay.
But Powery argues that for a secular reader, invoking God as the source is the ultimate philosophical thought stopper.
There's that phrase again.
Yeah, because it completely shuts down inquiry. It's really reminiscent of how early human civilizations blamed tsunamis or droughts on angry sea gods or sky deities.
Because they didn't have plate tectonics or meteorology yet.
Exactly.
If you just say, God did it, you stop trying to deeply understand the mechanics of the ocean or the atmosphere.
Yeah.
You just, sacrifice a goat and hope for the best.
Yeah, pretty much. There's this famous story about the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace. He told Napoleon, regarding the role of God in his astronomical models, I had no need of that hypothesis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Powery is basically applying Laplace to self-help. You don't need the God hypothesis to explain why these behavioral principles are so effective.
So here's where it gets really interesting. Because if God isn't the source, what is? We're just walking around with these invisible rules of effectiveness that seem to govern human interaction.
Right.
If they are divine laws, how does the secular critique actually redefine a principle?
Well, Powery redefines principles merely as ideas or, human-made mental models. They are not physical laws handed down from on high. They are just our brain's evolutionary attempt to spot patterns in reality.
Okay, I think I follow.
Think of the difference between the map and the terrain. Reality, like the actual physical and social universe we live in, is the terrain. The principle is just the map we draw to navigate it.
Okay, so let's test that map. Let's take habit 1, be proactive. Covey might say being proactive is a divine natural law, right?
Yeah.
A truth bestowed upon humanity.
Yeah.
How does the secular map explain why being proactive works so well?
On the secular map, habit 1 works simply because of the mechanics of cause and effect. Proactive people take initiative, they observe their environment, they think ahead, and they act before circumstances force their hand.
Right.
And because they behave this way, they physically position themselves to shape tomorrow's reality. When an economic shift happens or an opportunity arises in their industry, they are already prepared to leverage it.
So the universe isn't like rewarding them because they are obeying some divine law. The universe simply conforms to the physics of their behavior.
Exactly. Preparation meets opportunity, which results in success. Human minds observed this consistent pattern over thousands of years, extracted the core insight, and just called it a principle.
Yes. Okay, the map is incredibly useful, but we shouldn't confuse it for the terrain itself. It's just a biological and physical reality of cause and effect. Okay, I am fully on board with the map analogy, but talking about habit 1, being proactive, it brings us to what I think is the most intense philosophical tension in this entire deep dive.
Oh, the free will stuff.
Yes. Because habit 1 isn't just about taking initiative. Covey argues that the foundation of being proactive is that between a stimulus, meaning something happening to you, and your response to it, there is a gap.
Right, the gap.
And in that gap lies our absolute freedom to choose. He's talking about absolute free will.
And what's fascinating here is that Powery doesn't flinch away from the scientific reality of that claim.
Which is,
Well, from a cognitive neuroscience and physics perspective, the concept of absolute, unencumbered free will is highly debated. And a lot of experts argue it's actually an illusion.
wait, really?
Yeah, we are shaped by determinism. The laws of physics, our genetic makeup, our neurochemistry, our childhood environment, and all these predispositions that are completely outside of our control.
Wait, I have to stop you there because it feels like it breaks the entire book.
It does feel that way at first, yeah.
If we are just like biological algorithms reacting to stimuli based on a lifetime of prior conditioning, I mean, if I don't truly have free will, doesn't the entire concept of being proactive just collapse?
That's the big question.
If a secular reader accepts the hard science that free will is an illusion, aren't they just stuck being reactive robots?
This is exactly what Powery addresses. How do you reconcile a deterministic universe with a self-help book?
Mm.
And his answer is this brilliant, pragmatic twist.
Okay, listen.
He acknowledges that objectively, scientifically, free will might not exist. However, he argues that believing you have free will is an incredibly useful psychological tool.
A useful tool.
Yes, it is a fiction, yes, but it is a necessary fiction for personal effectiveness.
I really struggle with that. Are we just lying to ourselves to feel better?
Well, think about the behavioral outcomes of the belief, regardless of its objective truth. Powery describes this belief as a double-edged sword. Let's look at the negative edge first. If you believe in absolute free will, you take ownership of everything your brain does. This can lead to crushing guilt over just random intrusive thoughts.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, like you're standing on a balcony, your brain randomly generates the thought of jumping, and you spend the next 3 days agonizing over what a terrible person you are for choosing to think that.
Even though the thought was just a random neural firing, like
Yeah.
a biological misfire you didn't even author, you suffer because you believe you authored it.
Exactly. But look at the positive edge of the sword. By believing you have the freedom to choose your responses, you take ultimate responsibility for your actions.
Right. You refuse to play the victim of your circumstances.
You meticulously plan, you course correct, and you proactively build a better life. So the behavioral outcome of believing in free will is that you actually become highly effective.
Wow. So the secular advice is essentially conscious delusion. Lean into the illusion because the placebo effect of believing you were in control actually puts you in control.
Yes, it's pragmatism at its finest. You don't have to believe the gap between stimulus and response is a divine metaphysical soul. You just have to use the gap as a mental tool.
It's all about what works in the terrain.
Exactly. And this pragmatic approach helps the secular reader navigate some of the other friction points in the text as well.
Right, because Powery's essay points out a few other religious leftovers in the book beyond just the vocabulary of God and natural laws. There are cultural leftovers that feel very out of place for a broad, global, modern audience.
Yeah, the primary example he gives is how the book frequently relies on a heteronormative, traditional, monogamous family structure as the absolute default standard for ethical living and personal success.
Which directly reflects the specific religious and cultural norms of the author's background.
Yes, and that creates incredible friction for a modern reader.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
If you're a young secular professional trying to learn time management or, how to seek mutually beneficial agreements in business negotiations, suddenly bumping into an assumption that the peak of human maturity is a traditional 1980s nuclear family structure requires some serious mental gymnastics.
You have to constantly translate the advice into your own context.
Yeah.
Powery also points out direct, unvarnished quotes from religious figures that are treated as empirical evidence.
Oh, right, the sermon quote.
Yeah, for instance, Covey quotes Ezra Taft Benson, who is a prominent Mormon prophet, delivering a sermon about how the world attempts to shape human behavior from the outside in, but Christ can change human nature from the inside out.
And if I'm reading a business management book, a sudden theological sermon on Christ changing human nature is a massive speed bump. It completely jolts you out of the learning flow.
It really does.
So we have debated the philosophy, the vocabulary, the map versus the terrain, and this really interesting, useful fiction of free will. But all this debate rests on the assumption that these habits actually produce results.
Right. Do they actually work?
Exactly. We promised you listening a look at a systematic literature review from our source stack. Do these 7 habits actually work in the real world, according to hard science?
Well, the systematic academic review provides a very sobering perspective, actually, especially given how universally accepted the habits are.
Okay, break it down for us.
On one hand, the researchers note that Covey's humanistic, bottom-up approach aligns really well with modern, highly respected management theories.
Things like servant leadership, right?
Yes, concepts like self-leadership and servant leadership. The idea that a manager is there to remove obstacles for their team rather than just bark orders from a corner office, those are considered best practices today.
So the theoretical map checks out with modern organizational psychology. But what happens when they actually measure the terrain?
This is where the foundation gets pretty shaky. The systematic review reveals a glaring lack of robust, quasi-experimental data to prove that implementing the 7 habits directly causes measurable organizational outcomes.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The literature is packed with studies about the 7 habits, but the vast majority of the evidence relies heavily on self-reported data.
Let me get this straight. So researchers aren't looking at profit margins or employee retention rates before and after a company adopts the habits. They're just asking people, hey, did taking this expensive seminar make you a better leader?
That is the crux of the problem. It introduces massive common method bias.
Wow.
Think about the psychology of post-purchase rationalization.
Right.
If your company spends thousands of dollars sending you to a leadership retreat, or if you personally invest dozens of hours reading the book and doing all the exercises, you have a psychological vested interest in believing it worked.
Because if you admit you didn't improve, you're admitting you wasted your time and your money.
Exactly. Or you just want to look good on the survey your HR department is running.
Yeah, exactly, the kind of cognitive bias that completely corrupts self-reported data.
The reviewers note a distinct absence of longitudinal studies tracking objective, hard metrics over time.
So we just don't have the hard numbers.
We simply do not have enough rigorous, independent data saying, Company A implemented the 7 habits, and as a direct result of these specific behavioral changes, their operational efficiency objectively increased by 15% over a 5-year period.
So what does this all mean? We have this massive, globally beloved framework, built entirely on what the author claims are the undeniable natural laws of the universe. And yet the empirical scientific data proving these laws work in complex organizations is mostly anecdotal and self-reported.
Yeah.
It is deeply ironic.
It is ironic, but the researchers explicitly warn against throwing the baby out with the bathwater here.
Really, even with the lack of data.
Yeah, even without the hard longitudinal data, and even with the religious undertones that alienate secular readers, the ultimate goals of Covey's framework remain undeniably valuable.
Well, because the alternatives are worse, right?
Precisely. Fostering intrinsic motivation rather than relying on fear. Encouraging deep ethical behavior and integrity in a corporate world that, often rewards shortcuts.
Right.
Building actual resilient trust through emotional bank accounts rather than just transactional networking. These are profoundly positive forces in any organization or personal life. The fact that they are hard to measure on a spreadsheet doesn't negate their utility in the real world.
It really brings us right back to Powery's original premise. The book is 98% of the way there. The structure of the house is sound, the rooms are beautifully designed, and it provides incredible shelter from the chaos of modern life, even if we have to spend some time debating the nature of the concrete in the foundation.
Perfectly said.
So, to summarize this journey we have been on with you today, we took a beloved self-help classic, and through a secular lens, we systematically stripped away the theological thought stoppers.
We did.
We realized that secularism isn't cynicism, but rather a different, deeply meaningful way to interact with reality. We redefine these grand divine principles, not as laws handed down from the sky, but as highly useful mental maps that our brains evolved to navigate the terrain of human behavior.
And we embraced the free will paradox.
Right, the fascinating pragmatic paradox that even if free will is a scientific illusion, believing in it is the ultimate tool for personal effectiveness.
Huh?
And we grounded it all in the reality that while the hard science is still catching up to the anecdotes, the pursuit of an ethical, proactive life is universally worthwhile.
It is a rigorous, demanding way to engage with a text. You aren't just passively consuming advice, you are actively translating it. But, as we wrap up, it leaves me with one final thought to mull over, something that pushes against almost everything we just discussed today.
Oh, I like a good counter-argument. Let's hear it.
Well, if we successfully sanitize our philosophies, if we scrum away all the specific cultural, historical, or even religious baggage to make our frameworks perfectly logical and perfectly secular, do we risk sterilizing them so much that they actually lose their power?
Oh, wow.
Because human beings are rarely inspired to change their deepest behaviors by raw logic or perfectly sterile maps. We are moved by stories, by grand narratives, by a sense of touching something larger than ourselves.
Right.
Sometimes the myth is what actually provides the emotional fuel to take the journey, even if the analytical part of our brain knows it's just a map.
Does a perfectly sterile map still inspire you to walk out the door? That is a brilliant tension to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take these tools, use the fictions that serve you, and as always, keep questioning the maps you use to navigate your reality. See you next time.